On my wedding day, I walked down the aisle with a black eye. My fiancé smiled at my father and said she needed to learn. Some guests laughed while others stayed silent. I never defended myself. Instead, I waited until the officiant asked us to exchange vows. Then I made one move that brought the entire wedding to a standstill. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Eden, and I am 31 years old. I am a forensic auditor by profession, but within my own family, I have always been treated like a profound disappointment. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, meant living under a microscope of intense social expectations. My family was considered royalty in our community. We belonged to the upper echelon of society where appearances dictated everything, and the truth was constantly buried under designer clothes and fake smiles. The heavy oak doors of Greater Zion Fellowship swung open to reveal a sanctuary that looked more like a concert arena than a traditional church. My father, Pastor Calvin, had built this megachurch from the ground up. It was a massive architectural marvel with stadium seating designed to hold 2,000 congregants comfortably. Today, every single seat was filled. The most influential politicians, wealthy business owners, and prominent socialites in Atlanta had gathered to witness the wedding of the year. The church choir was singing a beautiful gospel hymn accompanied by a full live band. The music swelled, filling the cavernous space with a joyful noise that completely contradicted the absolute nightmare I was living. I stood at the threshold of the aisle wearing a custom Vera Wang bridal gown that had cost more than $60,000. The dress was a masterpiece of white silk and intricate hand-sewn lace that trailed heavily behind me. A long veil cascaded down my back, but I had explicitly refused to wear it over my face. I wanted everyone in this room to see exactly what they were celebrating. I wanted them to look directly at the swollen purple and black bruise that covered my entire right eye. The makeup artist had spent 2 hours frantically trying to apply heavy layers of expensive foundation and color correctors, but the physical trauma was simply too severe to hide. The swelling distorted my vision, and the dark, jagged edges of the bruise stood out violently against my skin. As I took my first step down the long, white carpeted aisle, the music seemed to fade into the background. Every eye in the massive sanctuary locked onto my face. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation, starting from the back pews and moving forward like a wave of cold water. Whispers immediately erupted, drowning out the choir. I could hear the sharp intakes of breath and the harsh judgments masking as concern. The church mothers in their extravagant Sunday hats leaned toward each other, shaking their heads in pity and disgust. The deacons in their tailored suits pointed and muttered behind their hands. They were all whispering about the pastor's daughter showing up to her own wedding looking like she had just survived a brutal street fight. No one stepped forward to help me. No one asked if I was safe. They simply stared and judged. I kept my head held high. I did not shed a single tear. I focused my uninjured eyes straight ahead, looking directly at the altar, where the men who orchestrated this horrific situation were waiting for me. Standing at the end of the aisle was Malik. He was 35 years old and widely celebrated as the most successful and flashy real estate developer in the city. He was dressed in a pristine white custom tuxedo with a diamond lapel pin that caught the bright stage lights. Malik was the picture of modern success. He was charming, wealthy, influential, and deeply corrupt. When I finally reached the altar, Malik did not look at me with an ounce of remorse. He did not ask if I was in pain or offer a word of comfort. Instead, he stepped forward and grabbed my hand. His grip was painfully tight, crushing my fingers together in a silent threat. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine. The smell of his expensive imported cologne made my stomach turn, because it was the exact same scent that had filled my lungs when he threw me to the floor last night. He looked right past my bruised face and caught the eye of my father. Pastor Calvin stood proudly behind the ornate glass pulpit, wearing his grand clerical robes that radiated authority and power. My father looked at my battered face and then looked at the man who had done it. Malik let out a low, arrogant chuckle that echoed through the microphones clipped to their lapels. She needed to learn her place last night, Malik said loudly, making sure the first few rows of VIP guests could hear every single word. She thought she could tell me how to run my business. She thought she could dictate terms to me. I had to teach her a lesson she would not forget. I stood perfectly still, waiting for my father to react. I waited for the man who had supposedly dedicated his life to preaching love and protection to act like a real parent. I waited for him to throw a punch, or demand an explanation, or instantly cancel the ceremony to protect his own daughter from a violent abuser. Instead, Pastor Calvin smiled. He actually smiled. He reached out across the altar and patted Malik firmly on the shoulder. "You did exactly what you had to do, son," my father replied smoothly, his voice devoid of any parental concern. A strong man must know how to lead his household and establish dominance early. Eden has been far too stubborn ever since she got that fancy degree from Spelman College. She thinks her education makes her the smartest person in the room. Sometimes a modern woman needs a firm hand to remind her who is truly providing for her and who holds the real power. I stood there listening to my own father validate and praise my physical abuse. He cared infinitely more about merging his untaxed church funds with Malik's real estate empire than he cared about my basic safety or human dignity. The profound betrayal did not stop at the altar. I shifted my gaze slightly to the right, where the front row of reserved luxury seating held the most important members of my family. My mother Vivica sat perfectly in the center of the pew. She was 60 years old and draped in a stunning emerald green designer gown. She was obsessed with status and image, constantly judging everyone around her. She did not look at my bruised face with a mother's compassion. Instead, she rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh. She frantically adjusted her expensive jewelry and leaned over to whisper to her favorite child. She just had to completely ruin the aesthetic of the wedding. Vivica complained loudly enough for me to hear over the soft instrumental music playing in the background. "We spent $500,000 on this production, and she shows up looking like absolute trash." She could not just keep her mouth shut and be an obedient wife. Now all my high society friends are staring at that hideous mark on her face. She has always been such an ugly disappointment. Sitting directly next to my mother was my younger sister Whitney. Whitney was 29 years old and the undeniable golden child of our family. She was remarkably spoiled, deeply entitled, and had never worked a single day of a real job in her life. She survived entirely on the massive amounts of wealth our parents funneled into her bank accounts. Whitney smirked at me, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. She leaned comfortably against her husband Spencer. Spencer was 33 years old, and he was a white man born into what he constantly claimed was massive generational wealth. He never missed a single opportunity to weaponize his white privilege and assert his arrogant dominance over me within my own family. He viewed all of us as his entertaining inferiors, but he harbored a special hatred for me because I was the only person who refused to bow to his condescending attitude. Spencer let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut through the quiet reverence of the sanctuary. "Well, look at the brilliant auditor now," Spencer sneered, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. She finally got exactly what she deserved for acting way too smart for her own good. "You people always think you can run the show, but reality hits hard. Maybe a good beating is exactly what she needed to learn how to shut her mouth and respect her betters. My family handles business without asking questions, and she needs to learn how the real world operates." Whitney giggled and nodded vigorously in agreement, wrapping her arms around Spencer's neck. "She really thought she was better than all of us just because she crunches numbers all day long," Whitney added, her voice dripping with venom. "She has absolutely no idea how to treat a highly successful black man. She should be getting down on her knees and thanking God that a man like Malik is even willing to marry her looking like that. She is lucky he did not cancel the whole thing." I listened to their incredibly cruel words. I absorbed every single insult and every mocking laugh. They truly thought they had me backed into a corner with no way out. They honestly believed that the severe physical beating last night had completely broken my spirit and forced me into submission. Malik had cornered me in his lavish home office, demanding that I immediately sign off on a massive stack of fraudulent tax returns for his various shell companies. When I refused to compromise my professional integrity and warned him about the legal consequences, he struck me hard across the face. He beat me until I fell to the hardwood floor, and then he stood over me and told me I would smile and marry him today, or he would completely destroy my life. My father had known about the violence. My mother had known about it. Whitney and Spencer had known about it. They all fully expected me to submit and suffer in silence because they desperately needed Malik's dirty money to cover up their own massive financial crimes. They thought I was just a weak numbers girl who could be bullied into compliance. They grossly underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. The sanctuary grew completely silent as the choir finished the final soaring verse of their opening song. The officiant, a highly respected bishop from a neighboring megachurch, stepped up to the microphone. He cleared his throat and looked at Malik and me with a serious, solemn expression. He began reading the traditional wedding vows, talking eloquently about love and honor and cherishing one another in sickness and in health. Every single word he spoke felt like broken glass tearing at my skin, but I maintained my absolute composure. I stared blankly at the massive stained glass windows at the back of the church, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to strike. "Do you, Malik, take Eden to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the officiant asked, his voice echoing through the massive room. "I do," Malik answered immediately, his voice incredibly loud and brimming with arrogant confidence. He squeezed my injured hand again, delivering a painful silent threat perfectly disguised as romantic affection. The officiant turned his attention to me. "And do you, Eden, take Malik to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward?" The entire megachurch held its collective breath. 2,000 people sat in complete silence, waiting for me to say the two short words that would legally sign my life away to a violent criminal. I remained completely silent. 1 second passed, then 5 seconds, then 10 long, agonizing seconds. The silence stretched out into an incredibly uncomfortable, heavy void that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Malik glared at me, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Say the words right now," he hissed under his breath, his charming facade cracking slightly. "Say them, or I swear you will regret it." I slowly and deliberately pulled my hand out of his crushing grip. I reached into the center of my lavish, trailing bridal bouquet. Hidden carefully among the pristine white roses and delicate orchids was a small encrypted black flash drive. I pulled it out, holding it up so the bright stage lights caught its metallic surface. "What are you doing?" my father demanded, stepping forward from behind the pulpit with a sudden look of sheer panic crossing his face. "Put that down and answer the Bishop, Eden." I did not answer him. I turned away from the altar and walked right past Malik, leaving him standing awkwardly in his custom tuxedo. I walked straight toward the massive state-of-the-art multimedia podium that controlled the church's extensive audio and visual systems. The podium had been specifically set up to play a romantic slideshow of our relationship immediately after the vows were exchanged. I forcefully shoved the surprised audio technician aside and plugged my encrypted flash drive directly into the main master port. I quickly typed a highly classified command sequence on the keyboard. Instantly, the giant LED screen suspended high above the choir loft flickered and changed. The romantic photos vanished completely. In their place, massive detailed spreadsheets appeared for the entire congregation to see. Official offshore bank statements from the Cayman Islands, with bright red highlights over highly illegal cash transfers, illuminated the dark sanctuary. Shell company registrations bearing Malik's undeniable signature alongside my father's official church tax identification numbers flashed across the giant screens in rapid succession. The documents on the screens were not just random numbers. They were meticulously categorized records of grand larceny. The congregation stared in shock as they saw their own generous tithes and building fund donations being routed directly into Malik's private real estate holding accounts. They saw invoices for Vivica's emerald green designer gown and Whitney's luxury vehicles paid for entirely by the church's charity outreach program. The depth of the corruption was staggering, and it was all laid bare in high definition for the entire city to witness. People in the pews began to stand up, pointing at the screens and shouting questions. The pristine, perfect image my family had spent decades cultivating was burning to the ground in a matter of seconds. I watched the absolute terror wash over my father's face as he realized his empire was collapsing. I watched my mother drop her face into her hands. I watched Spencer realize his proximity to this family might actually drag him down instead of lifting him up. Loud gasps of pure horror and total confusion erupted from the 2,000 guests as they continued to stare at the undeniable proof of massive financial fraud playing out above the altar. I grabbed the main wireless microphone from the podium, gripping it tightly in my hand. My voice boomed through the expensive sound system, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and reaching every single corner of the building. "I do not take this man," I announced, staring directly into Malik's suddenly terrified and pale face. "But the federal government will take his assets." The microphone went completely dead in my hand. A loud, sharp pop of static echoing through the cavernous sanctuary before total silence fell over the 2,000 guests in attendance. My father, Pastor Calvin, had frantically signaled the head deacon in the sound booth, his hands waving wildly in the air. He was practically vibrating with rage, his holy facade melting away instantly to reveal the terrified, corrupt businessman underneath. Before the congregation could even fully process the massive offshore bank statements still glowing brightly on the giant LED screens above the choir loft, my father lunged at me. His grip on my arm was like a vice, his thick fingers digging painfully into my skin, right below the puffy silk sleeve of my expensive wedding dress. He did not speak to the crowd. He did not offer a pastoral prayer to calm the rising panic or explain the documents. He just dragged me backward off the altar, his heavy breathing the only sound I could hear over the rustle of my heavy gown. The walk to the private vestry room behind the altar felt like a march to an execution. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind us, cutting off the rising roar of the confused and angry congregation. The vestry was a room built for quiet prayers and spiritual preparation, but right now it felt like a cold, concrete cell. The air was thick with the scent of burning candle wax and old wood. My father threw me toward the center of the room, his chest heaving under his ornate clerical robes. He paced back and forth, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of anger and fear. "You are ruining everything we have built, Eden. You are humiliating this entire family over a simple misunderstanding." Before I could even open my mouth to respond to his ridiculous attempt at gaslighting, the vestry doors violently flew open again and Malik stormed in. Malik was no longer the charming, successful real estate developer the city idolized. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure narcissistic rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his crisp white collar, and his perfectly tailored custom tuxedo jacket was thrown open. "You stupid little girl!" he screamed, taking heavy, aggressive steps toward me. "You think you can put some fake numbers on a screen and destroy me? I own the mayor. I play golf with the chief of police every single weekend. You are nothing. You are a crazy, bitter woman who is going to spend the rest of her life wishing she had just kept her mouth shut and played her part." He did not even hesitate. Fueled by his own massive arrogance and the assumption that I was still the submissive victim from last night, he lunged forward, his large hand raised high, ready to deliver another punishing blow to the left side of my face to match the severe purple bruising on my right eye. But I was no longer playing the role of the terrified, fragile fiancé. I had anticipated this exact movement, because abusers are always entirely predictable in their violence. As his arm came down, I smoothly stepped to the side, letting his own aggressive momentum carry him forward into the empty space where I had just been standing. I did not cower or raise my hands in defense. Instead, I pivoted sharply and drove the heel of my custom bridal shoe directly into the side of his right knee. The loud, sickening crack of his joint buckling echoed off the stone walls of the vestry room. Malik let out a strangled cry of absolute agony, his leg giving out completely beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the expensive Persian rug, clutching his knee and gasping for air. His pristine white tuxedo pants were instantly ruined, but I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man bleeding on the floor. My father stepped back in absolute shock, his hands raised in the air as if he were witnessing a ghost. He had never seen me fight back. None of them had. They had spent my entire life mistaking my quiet nature for weakness. I stood tall over Malik, looking down at the man who had terrorized me behind closed doors for months. "You hit me last night because you thought physical pain would break my professional spirit," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady in the quiet room. "You thought a black eye would make me too ashamed to look at the documents you shoved in my face. You beat me because I refused to blindly sign my name on your fraudulent tax returns." My father gasped, taking another step back until his back hit the wooden desk. I turned to look at the man who had raised me, the man who cared infinitely more about his untaxed wealth than his own daughter's physical safety. "I am not just a quiet little accountant, Dad," I explained, watching the color drain entirely from his face. "I am a forensic auditor. I specialize in dismantling complex white-collar financial crimes." Malik groaned on the floor, trying to push himself up, but the blinding pain in his knee kept him firmly grounded. "You have no proof," he spat through gritted teeth, sweat dripping down his forehead. "You are bluffing. No one is going to believe a hysterical woman with a black eye." I smiled, a cold, calculated smile that made him freeze in place. "I do not need to bluff, Malik. I know exactly how you do it. I spent the last 6 months quietly auditing every single ledger, every hidden offshore account, and every fake charity foundation tied to this mega church and your real estate firm. You take the cash donations from the church's weekly offerings and funnel them through your shell companies under the guise of fake community development projects. You inflate the construction costs of the new youth center by 400% and kick the profits back into a private trust controlled entirely by you and my father. I know about the phantom contractors who never laid a single brick. I know about the millions of dollars in tax-free church funds that were magically transformed into your new luxury condominiums downtown. I traced every single stolen dollar down to the last cent." My father slumped against the heavy wooden desk, his breathing shallow and incredibly rapid. "Eden, please," he whispered, his authoritative preaching voice reduced to a pathetic, weak croak. "We can fix this. We can explain the money to the congregation. You do not understand the immense pressure of running a ministry this large. We needed those outside investments to secure the legacy of this church for future generations." I stared at him, feeling nothing but absolute pure disgust for the man who was supposed to be my ultimate protector. "You sold me to a monster to cover your own tracks, Dad. You knew exactly what kind of man Malik was from the very beginning. You knew he was violent and controlling. You knew he was using me for my financial credentials so he could have a built-in scapegoat when the federal government finally came knocking. You sat in the front row today and smiled while he openly bragged about beating me into submission. There is no holy legacy left to secure here." 10 minutes before I walked down that aisle, I uploaded the entire decrypted file of your joint financial crimes to a secure server. The proof is already out there in the hands of the authorities. The bank statements on those screens were just a small preview for your wealthy friends in the pews outside. The crushing reality of my words settled heavily over the small vestry room. Malik stopped groaning and just stared blankly at the floor, his chest heaving with overwhelming panic as he finally realized the gravity of his situation. My father looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. The power dynamic in the room had completely and irreversibly shifted. I had spent my entire life being treated as the family scapegoat, the plain, quiet girl who preferred spreadsheets and data to social climbing and designer clothes. They had relentlessly mocked my dedication to my career, viewing it as a sad, lonely substitute for the glamorous, shallow life my sister Whitney led. They had fundamentally misunderstood that my quiet, observant nature was not submission. It was the meticulous, patient observation of a trained auditor gathering irrefutable evidence line by line until the case was absolutely airtight. I watched the two men who had actively tried to ruin my life realize that their massive empire of lies was crumbling into dust right before their eyes. The heavy, suffocating silence in the vestry was suddenly and violently shattered by the sound of the heavy oak doors being forcefully kicked open from the outside. The thick wood slammed against the stone wall with a massive crash that made my father visibly jump out of his skin. I turned around to see my brother-in-law Spencer striding confidently into the room. He was flanked by two massive armed private security guards wearing tactical vests over their dark tailored suits. Spencer looked entirely out of place in this sacred back room, but he carried himself with the supreme arrogant confidence of a man who believed his white privilege and family money made him completely invincible. He paused in the doorway to straighten his expensive custom suit jacket, smoothing down the lapels before casually running a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair. A smug, patronizing smile spread across his face as he took in the pathetic scene of Malik bleeding on the floor and my father trembling by the desk. "You really thought you could outsmart us?" Spencer said, his voice dripping with deep condescension. He stepped further into the room, acting as if he owned the very ground we stood on. "You actually believed a little girl with a calculator and a bad attitude could take down a sophisticated network that has been operating flawlessly for years. You constantly forget who you are dealing with, Eden. My family has generational wealth and deeply rooted political connections that you cannot even begin to comprehend. You are just a bitter, jealous woman throwing a massive public tantrum because she finally realized she will never be good enough to fit into this family." He snapped his fingers casually, and the two armed guards stepped forward, blocking the only exit from the vestry room. Their hands rested menacingly on the weapons secured at their waists. Spencer pulled a neatly folded piece of official-looking paper from his inner jacket pocket and waved it in the air like a winning lottery ticket. "I have to admit, it was a cute little theatrical stunt out there on the altar," he continued, his tone mocking and incredibly cruel. "But my family does not let minor inconveniences disrupt our lucrative business operations. I just had my highly paid private doctor sign a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold for you. He claims you are suffering from a severe psychotic break brought on by wedding stress and paranoid delusions regarding your finances." Spencer walked closer to me, his smile widening into something truly sinister. "By the time you manage to convince anyone in a locked mental ward that you are actually sane, we will have completely erased every single digital footprint you think you left, and we will have drained all the offshore accounts. No one is going to listen to a crazy woman raving about money laundering when she is strapped to a hospital bed." He pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, his arrogant eyes locking onto mine. "Cuff this crazy woman," he commanded the guards, his voice echoing off the stone walls as he prepared to make me disappear forever. The two massive security guards stepped forward immediately following Spencer's orders, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor of the vestry room. They reached for their tactical belts, pulling out thick plastic zip ties instead of metal handcuffs, clearly prepared to treat me like a dangerous animal rather than a human being. I stood my ground, completely unbothered by their threatening posture. Spencer crossed his arms over his chest, his expensive tailored suit shifting perfectly to accommodate his arrogant stance. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust, the kind of look he had been giving me since the very first day Whitney brought him home to meet our family. He had always despised my independence and my refusal to act suitably, impressed by his supposedly old money pedigree. Spencer took a slow, deliberate step closer to me, waving off the guards for just a moment so he could deliver his final crushing blow. "You really do not understand how the world works, Eden," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You walked out of Spelman College thinking that little piece of paper made you invincible, thinking it made you equal to people like me. But out here in the real world, your degree means absolutely nothing against generational wealth and entrenched political power. My family has been building networks in this country for over a century. We have judges on speed dial, We have senators at our dinner tables, and we have the kind of money that makes problems disappear. And right now you are a very annoying problem." He leaned in closer, his pale face contrasting sharply with the dark wood paneling of the vestry walls. "Do you know how incredibly easy it is for a family like mine to make a black woman vanish into the state mental health system?" He whispered, his words laced with a chilling racial superiority that he usually kept hidden behind polite suburban smiles. "One phone call to my private physician, and you become a tragic story of a stressed-out bride who suffered a complete psychotic break. No one will question it. Your own father will back up the medical assessment to save his church. Malik will play the heartbroken fiancé, and you will spend the next 5 years heavily medicated in a locked facility while we divide up whatever pathetic assets you manage to save from your little accounting job." Whitney stepped out from behind her husband's broad shoulders, her face twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. She adjusted the massive diamond ring on her left hand, making sure it caught the light from the overhead chandelier. She looked me up and down, taking in my bruised face and my torn wedding dress with pure satisfaction. "You have always been so hopelessly jealous of me, Eden," she sneered, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "You spent your entire life buried in boring spreadsheets and lonely library cubicles, trying to prove you were better than everyone else. But look at you now. You are a pathetic, bitter woman who cannot even keep a man without getting hit." Whitney walked over to Spencer and wrapped her arm around his waist, leaning her head against his shoulder in a perfect picture of manufactured domestic bliss. "I found a real man," she boasted, stroking Spencer's expensive lapel. "A wealthy, powerful white man who treats me like a queen and provides me with a lifestyle you could only dream of. Spencer protects me. He spoils me. He gives me everything I want because I actually know how to be a valuable wife. You wanted to ruin my perfect life today because you know you will never have a marriage like mine. You are just a miserable, lonely spinster who wants to drag everyone else down into the dirt with her." I let her finish her pathetic, delusional monologue. I stood completely still in the center of the room, letting the heavy silence settle over us, as her words faded into the corners of the vestry. The security guards shifted uncomfortably, waiting for Spencer to give them the final signal to restrain me. My father was still cowering near his desk, breathing heavily and refusing to look me in the eye. Malik was still groaning on the floor, clutching his shattered knee in agony. It was the perfect, dramatic tableau of a family that had built an empire entirely on lies and abuse. And then I started to laugh. It started as a soft chuckle deep in my chest and quickly grew into a full, loud, genuine laugh that filled the entire room. It was not a hysterical laugh or a nervous laugh. It was the relaxed, confident laughter of a woman who held absolutely every single card in the deck. Spencer's arrogant smile faltered slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. Whitney stepped back, her face flashing with sudden irritation at my refusal to play the terrified victim. "You think this is funny?" Spencer demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its smooth control. "You think a psychiatric hold is a joke? Guards, take her down right now." I held up a single hand palm facing outward, and the absolute authority in my gesture actually made the two massive guards pause in their tracks. I slowly reached into the hidden pocket sewn into the lining of my bridal gown and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was already unlocked and open to my secure federal email server. I looked at Spencer and watched the first tiny seed of doubt plant itself in his pale blue eyes. "You talk a really good game about generational wealth and political connections, Spencer," I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "You love to throw around your family name like it is an impenetrable shield that protects you from the consequences of the real world. But the thing about forensic auditing is that numbers never ever lie. People lie. Politicians lie. Arrogant little boys in expensive suits lie. But bank ledgers tell the absolute truth every single time." I tapped the screen of my phone, pulling up a highly classified federal document that had been forwarded to my secure server just 48 hours ago. I cleared my throat, making sure my projection was perfect. "Would you like to hear a story about your precious family, Spencer?" I asked, not waiting for his answer. Let us talk about the Southern District of New York. Let us talk about the federal indictments handed down exactly 3 days ago. Spencer completely froze. His arms dropped slowly to his sides, and the arrogant sneer on his face vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. His jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle pulsing under his skin. United States versus the Blackwell Family Trust? I read aloud, my voice projecting clearly across the silent vestry room. Counts 1 through 47 wire fraud, bank fraud, and operating an illegal Ponzi scheme spanning 3 decades. It turns out your legendary generational wealth is actually just a massive house of cards built on the stolen retirement funds of thousands of working-class people. The feds moved in on Tuesday morning, Spencer. They froze every single domestic and international asset tied to your family name. Your trust funds, your investment portfolios, your offshore tax havens. All of it is gone. Whitney let out a confused, nervous little laugh. "What is she talking about, Spencer?" she asked, pulling on his sleeve. "Tell her to shut up and just have her arrested." Spencer did not look at Whitney. He did not look at the guards. He was staring at me, his breathing suddenly shallow and rapid as the reality of his total destruction crashed down upon him. He was completely and utterly broke. The impenetrable shield of his white privilege and old money had been completely dismantled by the federal government, and he knew absolutely nothing about how to survive in a world where he could not buy his way out of trouble. "But you already knew about the financial trouble, did you not?" "Spencer?" I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You knew the money was running out months ago when the initial subpoenas were quietly served to your father's investment firm. You realized you were about to lose your access to millions and you panicked. How were you supposed to keep up the facade of the wealthy provider for your high-maintenance wife? How were you supposed to pay for her weekly shopping sprees and the country club memberships?" I turned my attention to Malik, who was still lying on the floor listening to every word with wide, terrified eyes. "That is when you discovered Malik's dirty little secret," I said, pointing down at my bleeding fiancé. "You used your family connections to run a quiet background check on the man marrying into your wife's family, and you stumbled right onto the massive money laundering operation between Malik's real estate firm and my father's church." My father let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the corner, but I ignored him completely. "Instead of turning him in, you saw an opportunity," I said, bringing my focus back to Spencer. "You started blackmailing Malik. You demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars in hush money, threatening to expose his fraud to the IRS if he did not fund your lavish lifestyle. You became a parasite feeding off another parasite. All that expensive designer clothing, all those first-class vacations you and Whitney took over the last 6 months, they were not paid for by your generational wealth, Spencer. They were paid for by the stolen tithes and offerings of the hard-working people sitting out there in those pews right now." Whitney physically recoiled from Spencer as if he had suddenly caught on fire. Her mind was visibly struggling to process the massive influx of information that completely shattered her entire worldview. The heavy silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Whitney dropping her limited edition, custom Hermes Birkin bag. The heavy leather purse hit the floor with a loud thud, spilling designer cosmetics and credit cards across the Persian rug. "Spencer, is this true?" Whitney asked, her voice trembling with rising panic. Her perfect, highly manicured facade was dissolving rapidly into raw desperation. "Tell me she is lying, Spencer. Tell me your trust fund is fine. Tell me we still have the money." Spencer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was flushed a deep mottled red, and he looked completely pathetic, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had strutted into the room just minutes ago, threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He swallowed hard, unable to meet his wife's furious gaze. "Answer me!" Whitney shrieked, grabbing the lapels of his expensive custom suit and shaking him violently. "The trust fund, Spencer. What about the house? What about my new G-Wagon? I just picked it up on Tuesday. Tell me it is paid for. Tell me we own it." I could not help the genuine bright smile that spread across my face, despite the throbbing pain in my bruised eye. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for, the complete and total demolition of my sister's unearned arrogance. I looked at Whitney and let out a soft, pitying sigh that I knew would drive her absolutely insane. You really do not pay attention to any of the paperwork you sign. Do you, Whitney? I asked, shaking my head slowly. You just care about the keys and the Instagram photos. Your brand new, perfectly detailed Mercedes G-Wagon is not paid for. Spencer does not have the credit or the cash to buy a bicycle right now, let alone a $200,000 luxury SUV. Whitney spun around to face me, her eyes wide with total panic. Then how did I get it? She demanded, her voice cracking. Spencer gave me the keys. He gave you the keys to a vehicle leased under one of Malik's anonymous shell companies, I explained, spelling it out for her as clearly as possible. Spencer forced Malik to take out the corporate lease as part of his blackmail demands. The car does not belong to you, Whitney. The mansion you live in is mortgaged to the absolute hilt under another one of Malik's fraudulent corporate entities. Your designer clothes, your jewelry, your entire life is completely rented. You do not own a single thing in this world. You are poorer than the people you look down on every single day. The absolute truth hit Whitney with the force of a freight train. Her entire identity, her entire sense of superiority over me was based exclusively on her material possessions and her marriage to a wealthy man. Discovering that her husband was a broke criminal who had been funding her life with stolen money, blackmailed from a domestic abuser, completely short-circuited her brain. The illusion of the perfect golden child with the perfect life vanished instantly, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow woman realizing she had absolutely zero skills and zero assets. Whitney slowly turned her head to look back at Spencer. Her breathing was heavy and ragged, her chest heaving under her expensive silk bridesmaid dress. Spencer raised his hands in a weak defensive gesture, finally finding his voice. "Baby, I can explain," he stammered, taking a step back from his furious wife. "We can figure this out. My lawyers are working on it. We just need a little bit of time to restructure." The slap echoed through the vestry room like a loud gunshot. Whitney swung her arm with everything she had, striking Spencer directly across the face. The force of the blow snapped his head sharply to the side, leaving a bright red handprint perfectly outlined on his pale cheek. Spencer stumbled backward, crashing into one of his own private security guards, who looked completely unsure of what to do in this bizarre domestic dispute. "You lied to me!" Whitney screamed, lunging forward and pounding her fists against Spencer's chest. "You told me you were rich. You told me we were set for life. You made me look like a fool in front of her." She pointed a shaking finger at me, tears of absolute fury and humiliation streaming down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. "I married you because you were supposed to take care of me. You are nothing. You are completely useless." Spencer grabbed her wrists roughly, trying to push her away, his own anger finally boiling over as his fragile male ego shattered completely. "Shut up, Whitney," he yelled back, his face contorted in rage. "You think you are so special. You are just a spoiled, greedy child who drains my bank accounts and complains when the luxury is not luxurious enough. You never loved me. You just loved the credit cards." Their perfect society marriage had completely disintegrated into a pathetic, violent screaming match in the middle of a church vestry. They were tearing each other apart, clawing at the remnants of their fake lives, while I simply stood back and watched the destruction unfold. The white savior complex had been utterly demolished, and the golden child was left standing in the ruins of her own profound ignorance. The trap had snapped shut, and there was absolutely no way out for any of them. The sounds of Whitney sobbing hysterically and Spencer shouting defensive excuses bounced off the cold stone walls. But those sounds were suddenly cut short by a piercing, visceral scream of pure maternal rage. Vivica could no longer stand to watch the total destruction of her perfect golden child. The carefully constructed illusion of her highly successful family was evaporating into thin air, and her fragile, narcissistic mind simply could not process the humiliation. She completely lost her mind. She ignored her bleeding future son-in-law on the floor. She ignored her trembling husband. She pushed past the confused security guards and charged directly across the Persian rug toward me. Her emerald green designer gown swept around her legs as she closed the distance. Her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. Before I could even brace myself, she raised her hand and struck me. The slap was incredibly hard. Her heavy diamond ring scraped across my skin as her palm connected violently with my left cheek, the only part of my face that was not already covered in dark purple bruises from Malik's assault the night before. The sharp cracking sound of the impact echoed loudly, silencing Whitney's sobs and Spencer's shouting. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow. A hot, stinging sensation instantly spread across my skin, and the metallic taste of fresh blood flooded my mouth where my teeth had bitten into the soft inside of my lower lip. I slowly turned my head back to look at my mother. I did not raise my hand to touch my burning cheek. I did not cry. I simply stared at the woman who had given birth to me, watching her completely unravel. "You ruin everything!" Vivica screamed, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria. "You ruin every single thing you touch, Eden. You have always been a bitter, ugly little outcast, and you just could not stand to see your sister happy. You just had to destroy her perfect life, because you know you will never have one of your own. You are a cancer in this family. You have been a cancer since the day you were born." She took another step closer, pointing a manicured finger directly between my eyes. She was shaking with so much rage that her expensive pearl necklace rattled against her collarbone. "You never fit into this family," she continued, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "You never looked right. You never acted right. You refused to smile for the church cameras. You refused to dress the way I told you to dress. You sat in your room reading those stupid books about numbers and laws while your sister was out building the family brand. You think you are so brilliant because you have a career, but you are nothing. You are absolutely nothing, and you will always be nothing." I let her scream. I let her pour out 31 years of suppressed venom and resentment. The repetitive nature of her insults was deeply revealing. She needed to repeat the word nothing over and over again to convince herself that it was true. Her entire identity was completely dependent on my subjugation. "You are so incredibly jealous of Whitney that it is making you insane!" Vivica yelled, waving her hands wildly toward where my sister was still crying on the floor. "Whitney knows how to play the game. Whitney knows how to be a beautiful, respectable woman who brings value to this ministry. All you do is bring shame. You are embarrassing your father in front of the entire city right now. You are embarrassing me. You should be on your knees begging Malik for forgiveness because he is the only successful man who would ever look twice at a miserable, ungrateful woman like you." I swallowed the blood in my mouth. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. "You sold me to a violent criminal to cover up your stolen money, Mom," I said, my voice completely calm and devoid of any emotional reaction. "You call that bringing value to the ministry?" My absolute lack of fear pushed Vivica completely over the edge of sanity. She wanted to see me break. She desperately needed to see me cry and beg for her maternal approval, just like I used to do when I was a little girl. When she realized her physical violence and her verbal insults were no longer working, she reached for the ultimate weapon. She reached for the deepest, darkest secret this corrupt family had ever buried. She wanted to prove my absolute worthlessness so badly that she deliberately exposed her own massive criminal fraud just to inflict maximum psychological pain. "You really think you are so independent?" Vivica laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that lacked any real humor. "You think you built your little accounting career all by yourself? You should be getting down on the floor and thanking us that we even kept you around Eden. You should be grateful we fed you and clothed you because you never belonged to us. You belonged to that crazy old woman." The air in the vestry room seemed to grow 10 degrees colder. My father suddenly snapped his head up from the desk, his eyes widening in total horror as he realized exactly what his wife was about to say. "Vivica, do not say another word," my father warned, his voice hoarse and panicked. Vivica completely ignored him. She was completely blinded by her own venomous rage. Your precious biological grandmother hated this church. Vivica continued her words, tumbling out in a rapid, vicious stream. She hated my husband and she hated me. She saw right through the television broadcasts and the luxury cars. She said we were greedy parasites living off the poor. She knew she was dying of cancer, and she knew we were waiting to inherit her massive estate. So she changed her will behind our backs. She liquidated her entire stock portfolio and placed it into a private trust. A $5 million trust fund completely locked away and completely untouchable. And she left every single penny of it exclusively to you. My mother stepped even closer, her breath hot against my face. Her eyes were wide and manic as she delivered the final crushing blow. $5 million for the ugly little outcast, she spat. She wrote in her diary that you were the only person in this family with a pure heart. She wanted you to have the freedom to escape us. But she was a stupid old woman, and she severely underestimated exactly how much power your father holds in this city. Vivica, my father shouted, taking a desperate step forward. Shut your mouth right now! You are talking too much! But Vivica was entirely out of control. She loved the sound of her own voice, and she loved the feeling of absolute power it gave her to crush my spirit. We were not going to let a 5-year-old girl inherit $5 million while we were struggling to build the foundation of this megachurch. Vivica bragged, her tone shifting into twisted pride. We were not going to let you have financial independence because you did not fit the family brand, Eden. You were too dark. Your hair was too difficult. You were too stubborn. You would have taken that money and run away, leaving us with nothing. So your father and I made a decision. We brought in the best corporate lawyers in the state. We brought in Spencer's father and his highly unethical banking connections. Spencer groaned from the corner, suddenly realizing that his own family name was now being directly implicated in this massive confession. We forged the medical documents, Vivica confessed loudly, her voice bouncing off the stone walls for the security guards to hear. We forged the psychological evaluations claiming your grandmother was suffering from severe dementia when she changed the will. We paid off the notary. We paid off the attending physicians. We had her final testament completely invalidated in probate court. The entire $5 million defaulted back to the primary estate, and your father and I took every single cent of it. She pointed aggressively at Whitney, who was still sitting on the floor listening to this confession in stunned silence. You see that diamond necklace on your sister's neck? Vivica demanded, pointing a shaking finger. That is your grandmother's money. You see the mansion Spencer and Whitney live in. That is your grandmother's money. And that real estate development firm that Malik started 10 years ago. The seed money came directly from your stolen trust fund. We took your entire future, Eden. We took your freedom, and we used it to build an empire for the people in this family who actually deserved to be successful. We literally own your entire existence. You think you caught us today, but we beat you 26 years ago. You have absolutely nothing. The silence that followed her confession was absolute. The echo of her words faded, leaving a heavy, suffocating tension in the room. Vivica stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for me to collapse into tears. She waited for me to drop to my knees and scream in agony at the realization that my entire life had been stolen from me. She wanted to drink my pain like wine. I did not give her a single drop. I slowly ran my tongue over my bottom lip, tasting the warm metallic tang of the blood that was still pooling in the corner of my mouth. I looked at my mother and felt a profound sense of closure. Her confession was the final piece of the puzzle. The missing link that tied the generational theft directly to the current money laundering operation. She had just admitted to a massive coordinated conspiracy involving multiple individuals, and she had done it completely voluntarily. My father finally found the physical strength to move. He pushed himself off the heavy wooden desk and stormed across the room, grabbing Vivica roughly by her upper arm. He yanked her backward away from me, his face pale and shining with cold sweat. Are you completely insane? He hissed at his wife, his fingers digging into her skin. Do you have any idea what you just said out loud? He shoved Vivica behind him, effectively shielding her from my view. Pastor Calvin quickly adjusted his clerical robes, taking a deep breath to compose himself. He pulled his shoulders back and arranged his features into the cold, dead stare he always used when negotiating aggressive business contracts. He was desperately trying to regain control of the room, trying to pivot back to his position of absolute authority. He looked at me with eyes that contained absolutely no paternal love. There was only the cold calculation of a man trying to manage a massive liability. "My wife is highly emotional right now," Pastor Calvin said, his voice dropping an octave to sound deep and authoritative. "She is speaking out of extreme distress because you have deliberately ruined this beautiful, holy ceremony. She is simply making up stories to hurt your feelings because you hurt hers." He took a slow, measured step toward me, projecting his physical dominance. "You listen to me very carefully, Eden," he said, his tone entirely flat and threatening. "There is absolutely no proof of any trust fund. There are no forged documents. Those doctors and notaries from 26 years ago are either dead or completely untraceable. It is the word of a highly stressed mother against a daughter who is clearly suffering from a violent psychotic break. You can try to take that little story to the police, but they will laugh you right out of the precinct. My lawyers will bury you in so much litigation you will never see the light of day." He leaned his face close to mine, expecting me to cower in fear. "You really thought you could come in here and destroy my legacy," he whispered coldly. "You thought you could tear down the house of God. But you are still exactly what you have always been, Eden. You are still nothing." I held his dead stare without blinking. I slowly raised the back of my hand and deliberately wiped the fresh blood from my lower lip. The red stain smeared across the pristine white lace of my expensive bridal glove. I did not break eye contact with the man who had stolen my future to fund his fraudulent empire. I reached my hand slowly into the structured bodice of my custom Vera Wang gown. My fingers curled around a thick, crisp paper envelope that I had carefully hidden against my skin before I walked down the aisle. I pulled it out into the light. It was a bright crimson-red envelope sealed with a thick stamp of dark black wax. I held the red envelope up between us so close that my father could clearly see the official gold foil seal of the United States Department of the Treasury embossed on the front. "I do not need proof, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "I already collected the debt." I ripped open the thick red envelope with my blood-stained glove. The tearing of the heavy paper sounded incredibly loud in the dead silence of the vestry room. My father stared at the envelope, as if it were a loaded weapon. Vivica had stopped breathing entirely, her hand still hovering near her chest, where she had clutched her pearls. Spencer and Whitney were completely frozen in the corner, their own toxic marriage momentarily forgotten, as they watched me pull out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. I let the silence stretch for a few more agonizing seconds before I finally spoke. "You spent the last 5 years telling everyone I was a bitter antisocial outcast." I began, my voice echoing clearly off the vaulted ceilings. "You told your wealthy friends I was just a boring little number cruncher who lacked the social grace to build the family brand. You laughed at my modest clothes and my quiet weekends. But while you were busy hosting lavish charity galas and buying imported luxury cars with stolen money, I was doing exactly what I do best. I was crunching the numbers. I was tracking every single fraudulent dollar that moved through the offering plates of this massive church. I traced the physical cash donations as they were funneled out of the ministry operating accounts and washed cleanly through Malik's fake construction shell companies. I saw the bloated invoices for plumbing and electrical work that never actually happened. I documented the phantom employees on the payroll who were quietly funneling money back into your personal trust accounts." Malik let out a pathetic groan from the floor, his hand still gripping his shattered knee, but he was listening to every single word. "You thought you were a financial genius, Malik," I said, looking down at his ruined custom tuxedo. "You thought your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely invisible to the federal government. You bragged about your complex corporate structures, but your paper trail was incredibly sloppy and amateurish. You left digital fingerprints all over the fake invoices you submitted to the church building fund. You used the same IP addresses for your legitimate businesses and your illegal shell companies. It took me exactly 3 months to map out your entire money laundering network, but I did not go to the authorities right away. I knew that simply putting you in a federal prison was not enough punishment for what you did to me. I wanted to completely dismantle your empire from the inside out. I wanted to take absolutely everything you loved and burn it to the ground. My father wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead, his breathing growing dangerously shallow. His clerical robes suddenly looked far too big for his shrinking frame. "Eden, what did you do?" he whispered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. I smiled and separated the thick stack of documents in my hands. I used my professional credentials and my pristine federal reputation to approach the massive private equity firms that held the commercial loans on your properties. I explained slowly, making sure they understood every single detail of their total destruction. The corporate banks were already getting highly suspicious of your inflated equity reports and delayed tax filings. They knew the federal government was quietly circling your operations. They were absolutely desperate to offload your highly toxic loans before the criminal indictments dropped and the assets were formally seized by the government. So I created a complex network of legitimate holding companies using the $5 million you thought you stole from my grandmother as my initial leverage, and I bought your debt. Spencer let out a loud gasp from the corner of the room, pushing past Whitney as he stumbled forward. His face was twisted into a mask of pure disbelief. "You cannot just buy our corporate debt," he yelled, his voice shaking with denial. "That takes hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid capital. You are just a low-level government auditor. You do not have that kind of financial backing. It is mathematically impossible." I looked at my arrogant brother-in-law and felt a deep wave of pure satisfaction. "I did not need hundreds of millions of dollars, Spencer," I said, my tone completely flat and clinical. "I bought your massive debt portfolios for literal pennies on the dollar because the institutional investors knew the true market value of your fraudulent assets was absolutely zero. They wanted to wash their hands of your massive Ponzi scheme before they became legally liable for your financial crimes and public scandals. I am the only person on Earth who was willing to take on the toxic liability of the Blackwell family trust and Malik's crumbling real estate empire. I essentially bought your entire lives for the price of a cheap used car." The crushing reality of the situation finally settled over the cold vestry room. The air felt incredibly heavy, suffocating the 4 people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my spirit. I stepped right up to the heavy wooden desk where my father was cowering, and I slammed the first packet of legal documents down onto the polished surface. The loud sudden thud made my mother flinch violently, covering her ears with her hands. "I am your sole creditor now," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "I hold the exclusive deed to this entire megachurch. Every single brick, every stained glass window, every expensive microphone sitting on that altar outside, it all belongs entirely to me. You do not own the house of God, Dad. You are just a highly delinquent tenant who is currently in breach of contract." I took the second packet of dense legal documents and dropped it directly onto the first one. Malik squeezed his eyes shut as the heavy paper hit the desk, realizing his reign of terror was officially over. "I hold the commercial titles to your luxury penthouses downtown." I continued, staring down at my bleeding, violent fiancé. "The beautiful properties you bought with the stolen tithes from the congregation and the fake community development grants intended for low-income housing. They are legally mine now, and I am liquidating them immediately." I dropped the third and final packet onto the stack and turned my head to look directly at my sister Whitney. She was violently shaking her hands, covering her mouth as she realized exactly what was coming next. "And your sprawling suburban mansion, Whitney," I said, watching tears of pure terror stream down her perfectly contoured face. "The massive estate where you host your exclusive high society parties and pretend you are vastly superior to everyone else in this city." The house you used as proof that you were the successful golden child. I hold the primary mortgage on that property too. You have absolutely zero assets left to your names, I told the room, my voice completely devoid of any human sympathy. The corporate bank accounts are frozen by the feds. The generational trust funds are completely empty. The luxury cars are leased under fake names, and the properties are completely foreclosed. Those legal documents on the desk are your official eviction notices. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your expensive designer clothes and vacate my properties before I have the county sheriff physically remove you from the premises and change every single lock. You are completely broke. You are officially homeless. And you are all going to federal prison for a very long time. The silence in the room was absolute and devastating. Vivica let out a low, wailing sob and collapsed onto a small wooden bench in the corner, hiding her face in her hands as her entire universe was entirely obliterated. She had traded her own daughter's safety and sanity for the pathetic illusion of wealth, and now she was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. Spencer leaned heavily against the cold stone wall, looking like he might violently vomit as the reality of his total financial ruin set in. His pristine family name, his white privilege, his arrogant power, all of it had been entirely erased by the very woman he had relentlessly mocked for years. Whitney just stood there shaking uncontrollably, completely unable to process the horrifying fact that she was now significantly poorer than the working-class people she actively despised. I stood there taking in the total destruction of the people who had abused me for decades. I remembered all the late nights I had spent sitting at my computer desk nursing the physical bruises Malik had given me. I remembered using frozen ice packs to reduce the swelling on my face and ribs, while I meticulously tracked the fraudulent wire transfers across international borders. Every single punch he landed on my body had only fueled my absolute determination to utterly dismantle his life piece by piece. I remembered sitting silently at family dinners, listening to them brag about their expensive European vacations and their massive homes, knowing the entire time that I had already drafted the foreclosure papers that would rip it all away. My quietness was never submission. It was always meticulous, calculated preparation. But the most violent reaction came from the man bleeding heavily on the Persian rug. Malik had been lying in agonizing physical pain, listening as I systematically dismantled the massive empire he had built through relentless violence and financial fraud. The realization that his entire life was completely over, that he was utterly ruined and facing decades behind cold iron bars, finally snapped the last remaining thread of his sanity. He ignored his shattered knee and dragged his body across the floor, using his massive upper body strength to pull himself toward the heavy wooden desk. He reached up with a shaking, bloody hand and grabbed the edge of the polished wood, pulling himself up just enough to look directly into the eyes of my father. Pastor Calvin shrank back against the wall, terrified of the violent monster he had deliberately brought into our family. Malik's face was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. His eyes were completely bloodshot and saliva mixed with fresh blood dripped from his mouth as he bared his teeth at the man who was supposed to be his holy father-in-law. "You promised me!" Malik screamed, his deep voice tearing through the vestry room like a wounded wild animal. "You looked me directly in the eye, and you promised me you had her completely under control, Calvin. You told me she was just a weak, pathetic little girl who would do whatever she was told." My father tried to speak, tried to offer some kind of pathetic, weak pastoral excuse to calm the enraged man down. But Malik would not let him get a single word out. "You set me up!" Malik roared, pounding his heavy fist against the side of the wooden desk, causing the foreclosure papers to jump. "You told me that if I married your daughter, the federal auditors would never look twice at the church finances because her presence would validate the books. You said her spotless professional credentials would make the entire money laundering operation look completely legitimate to the IRS. You told me that if she ever stepped out of line or started asking too many questions, I had your absolute complete permission to put my hands on her and teach her a painful lesson. You literally handed her to me. You sold your own flesh and blood daughter to me just to hide your massive tax evasion, and you promised me it would save the business. The absolute ultimate betrayal echoed through the small, cold stone room, bouncing off the walls and settling directly into my chest. My mother stopped her pathetic sobbing and looked up at her husband in complete shock. Even Spencer and Whitney seemed momentarily stunned by the sheer dark depravity of what Malik had just publicly revealed. My father, the revered community pastor, the holy man who stood on a massive stage every single Sunday and preached about unconditional love and divine protection, had actively orchestrated my brutal physical abuse. He had not just turned a blind eye to Malik's violence out of ignorance, he had specifically authorized it. He had deliberately sold my life, my physical safety, and my hard-earned professional reputation to a violent, controlling criminal solely to create a convenient human shield for his massive money laundering operation. I stared at my father, watching the absolute cowardice radiate from every pore of his sweating face. He had traded his own daughter for the pathetic illusion of earthly power, and now he was going to lose absolutely everything. The small vestry room could no longer contain the explosive and volatile violence of a family completely tearing itself apart. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne sweat and the coppery tang of fresh blood. Malik dragged his broken body forward, his bloody hands grasping wildly at my father's thick, ornate clerical robes, pulling the older man down toward the floor in a desperate attempt to exact some kind of physical revenge. My father kicked out blindly his polished custom leather shoes, making hard contact with Malik's ribs. Vivica shrieked at the top of her lungs and threw herself into the tangled mess of men. Her emerald green designer gown ripped loudly as her manicured nails clawed at Malik's face in a frantic manic attempt to protect her husband and the crumbling illusion of her empire. Spencer and Whitney were still locked in their own vicious and pathetic struggle. They crashed heavily against the solid wooden desk, sending heavy brass lamps and a tall stack of leather-bound Bibles crashing to the stone floor. I stepped backward, pressing my spine against the cool concrete wall, simply watching the sheer absolute absurdity of these incredibly wealthy, incredibly arrogant people fighting like feral cornered animals. The combined physical weight of Malik and my father slammed violently into the heavy oak doors that separated the private prayer room from the main sanctuary altar. The thick iron hinges groaned under the sudden immense pressure. With a loud, splintering crack, the doors burst wide open. The tangled mass of bleeding, screaming family members tumbled directly out onto the pristine white carpet of the main stage right in front of the massive glass pulpit. The bright theatrical stage lights hit them instantly, illuminating the total and complete destruction of the Blackwell and Wilson family brands for everyone to see. 2,000 wedding guests sat completely frozen in the stadium seating of Greater Zion Fellowship. A collective heavy gasp of pure horror rose up from the crowd, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and the massive stained glass windows. Just moments ago, they had been staring at confusing financial spreadsheets, flashing on the giant LED screens above the choir loft, muttering to each other in shocked, bewildered whispers. But now the abstract financial fraud had suddenly become a brutal and undeniable physical reality. They watched their revered spiritual leader, Pastor Calvin, rolling on the floor in a desperate wrestling match with the city's most prominent real estate developer. They saw the pastor's elegant wife Vivica screaming like a banshee, her expensive dress torn and stained with sweat and dirt. They saw the golden child Whitney slapping her supposedly wealthy husband across the face right next to the Holy Communion table. Utter chaos erupted in the first few rows of the church. The wealthy socialites, the local politicians, and the church mothers who had been judging my bruised face only 20 minutes earlier now clutched their chests in sheer, unadulterated panic. The board of deacons and the senior church elders men who had helped my father build this mega church from the ground up scrambled out of their reserved luxury seats and rushed the stage. Their heavy footsteps pounded against the wooden stairs as they demanded to know what in the world was happening to their sacred sanctuary. The live gospel band in the corner had completely abandoned their instruments, the drummer backing away from his kit in pure shock. The entire megachurch was vibrating with total confusion and a rapidly rising tide of panic. I walked slowly out of the vestry room, stepping carefully over the broken threshold. My heavy wedding gown swished softly against the carpet as I stood above the writhing mass of my family, looking out at the massive sea of faces. My father realized the devastating reality of his public exposure. He shoved Malik away with a heavy grunt and scrambled to his knees, gasping for air. His grand clerical robes were ripped at the collar, and a long, thin scratch ran down the side of his cheek, where Vivica had accidentally caught him with her massive diamond rings. He pushed himself to his feet, staggering slightly as he leaned heavily against the ornate glass pulpit for support. He looked out at the 2,000 angry, confused faces of his congregation, and his survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He reached up and tapped his wireless lapel microphone, checking to see if it was still active and broadcasting through the sanctuary speakers. It was. He cleared his throat, and suddenly the panicked, desperate man vanished entirely. In his place, the charismatic, powerful megachurch pastor returned. His posture straightened, his shoulders went back, and his face contorted into a masterful expression of deep, profound sorrow. "My beloved flock," he began, his voice booming through the massive state-of-the-art sound system, rich with practiced emotional resonance. "The devil is a liar, and the devil is actively working inside this holy sanctuary today to test our faith." A heavy hush fell over the front rows as his authoritative preaching cadence commanded their absolute attention. He pointed a trembling, theatrical finger directly at me. "My beautiful daughter Eden has been suffering in terrible silence," he cried, a fake tear actually rolling down his cheek, catching the stage lights. "The stress of this wedding and the dark pressure of her worldly career have broken her fragile mind. She is suffering from a severe psychotic break, a demonic attack on her sanity and her soul. She has fabricated these malicious lies and these confusing documents on the screens to destroy the holy work we are doing here in the city. She violently attacked her loving fiancé. She is deeply unwell, and she needs our grace. I ask you, my faithful congregation, to bow your heads right now and pray for her tortured mind. Pray that the demons of jealousy and madness are cast out of her right now in this very room." It was a truly masterful performance. I could actually see some of the older congregants in the crowd nodding slowly, their hands raised in the air, ready to believe the comforting lie, because it was so much easier than accepting the horrifying truth that their beloved pastor was a common thief. My father looked at me out of the corner of his eye, and I saw the cold, dead stare of a man who would gladly sacrifice his own child to a locked psychiatric ward just to keep his greedy hands on the church treasury. He truly believed he had won. He believed his charisma could override cold hard data. But he was relying on old theatrical tricks in a modern digital world, and he fundamentally underestimated the forensic auditor standing 10 feet away from him. I did not scream. I did not argue with his ridiculous demonic narrative. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. During my 6 months of meticulous investigation, I had not just audited the church bank accounts, I had also mapped out their entire digital infrastructure. Greater Zion Fellowship boasted a massive state-of-the-art public Wi-Fi network designed to accommodate thousands of concurrent users during their massive Sunday services. I had already bypassed their primitive security firewalls weeks ago, establishing myself as the supreme network administrator. I tapped a sequence of pre-programmed commands on my screen, accessing the main audio-visual control panel. I instantly cut the power to my father's wireless microphone. His booming preaching voice was abruptly replaced by a harsh, high-pitched squeal of feedback that made the entire congregation wince and cover their ears in pain. He tapped the dead microphone in a panic, his mouth still moving but producing absolutely no sound. Then I initiated the final protocol. I triggered a mass emergency file drop, a forced local network transfer that bypassed personal privacy settings by utilizing the church's mandatory Wi-Fi login terms of service. Everyone in the building who was connected to the network was about to receive a direct message. It happened simultaneously across the entire massive cavernous sanctuary. 2,000 smartphones pinged, buzzed, and vibrated at the exact same second. The sound was like a massive swarm of electronic locusts washing over the stadium seating. People looked down at their screens in complete confusion. The glowing displays illuminated their faces in the dim light of the church, creating a sea of tiny blue screens. I had sent them a highly condensed, incredibly easy-to-read document. It was not a complex web of corporate shell companies or confusing federal tax returns. It was a direct line-by-line bank statement from the Greater Zion Fellowship Community Building Fund. This was the exact fund that these hard-working people had been donating their meager savings to for the past 3 years. Elderly men and women on fixed retirement incomes, single mothers working multiple minimum wage jobs, dedicated families giving 10% of their paychecks, all hoping to build a new youth center and safe haven for the impoverished neighborhoods nearby. They had trusted my father with their money and their faith. The document on their phones clearly showed millions of dollars being transferred directly from the community fund into a private offshore trust controlled entirely by my father and Malik. And right below those massive transfers were the corresponding receipts. They were highly detailed invoices from the most exclusive luxury jewelers in Europe and high-end car dealerships. The congregation read in real time how their $10 and $20 weekly sacrifices were pooled together to purchase Vivica's $200,000 emerald necklace. They saw the itemized receipts for Whitney's lavish shopping sprees, the designer bags she was currently crying over. They saw the massive down payment on the pastor's third vacation home in the Hamptons. They saw the private jet charters to Paris. Every single luxury my family enjoyed had been directly stolen from the pockets of the people sitting in this room. The realization rippled through the crowd, turning the initial shock into a rising tide of absolute, raw, terrifying fury. The quiet murmurs turned into loud, angry shouts. "The devil did not steal your youth center!" I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room without the need for a microphone. "Your pastor did." The explosion of rage that followed was deafening. The church elders who had been standing on the stage turned to look at my father, their faces contorted with profound betrayal and sheer anger. They realized they had been used as pawns to legitimize a massive criminal enterprise. Men and women in the pews began to stand up screaming and throwing their glossy wedding programs onto the floor. The front rows surged forward, pressing against the steps of the altar. The head deacon's men who had trusted Calvin with their spiritual lives and their life savings did not move to protect him. They had spent years defending this man against rumors and audits, blindly believing in his divine mission. Now the digital proof of their foolishness burned brightly on their personal phone screens. They exchanged dark, knowing glances and marched directly past the altar, moving straight to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary. The loud, heavy thud of the brass deadbolts locking echoed like a prison cell closing. They blocked every single exit, standing shoulder to shoulder with their arms crossed. They were trapping the corrupt shepherd inside with his furious flock. The crowd began marching toward the stage, their voices joining together in a deafening chant, demanding their stolen money back. The sheer volume of their collective anger shook the floorboards beneath my feet. My father backed away from the edge of the stage, trembling violently as he realized there was absolutely no escape from the reckoning. Vivica scrambled backward across the carpet, crying out for the security guards who had already abandoned their posts and fled the building to save themselves. Malik tried to drag his broken body toward the vestry door, but an angry elder placed a firm boot squarely on his uninjured leg, pinning him to the floor. Spencer and Whitney huddled together in the corner, surrounded by the very people they had stolen from and mocked for years. The house of cards had completely collapsed, and the congregation was ready to collect their due. The sheer volume of the congregation's collective fury was like a physical weight pressing down on the stage. 2,000 people who had just realized their hard-earned money was stolen were surging forward, pressing against the wooden steps of the altar. The head deacons stood firm at the back exits, their arms crossed over their chests, effectively trapping the corrupt shepherd and his furious flock inside the massive sanctuary. Pure, unadulterated panic set in among my family members as the reality of their inescapable doom finally crashed down upon them. Over by the shattered glass of the pulpit, Spencer looked out at the angry mob of churchgoers and completely lost what little nerve he had left. The arrogant investment banker, whose entire identity was built on tailored suits and unearned confidence, realized that his white-collar privilege meant absolutely nothing in this room. He scrambled away from Whitney, completely abandoning his weeping wife in the corner. His expensive leather shoes slipped frantically on the polished wood as he tried to sprint toward a narrow side door that led to the private administrative offices and the alleyway beyond. He did not even make it 5 steps. A group of angry choir members, men who had spent years listening to my father preach about sacrifice, while Spencer parked his imported sports cars in the reserved lot, saw him making a run for it. They lunged forward, moving with a sudden violent coordination. 3 broad-shouldered men in deep burgundy choir robes tackled Spencer directly to the hardwood floor. Spencer went down hard, letting out a high-pitched scream of panic as his chin slammed against the floorboards. The choir members pinned his arms behind his back, ignoring his pathetic demands to be let go, pressing their knees into his spine to ensure the coward could not escape the reckoning. Malik saw Spencer go down, and the last remaining shred of his composure completely shattered. He was pinned to the floor by the heavy boot of an angry church elder, his shattered knee throbbing in absolute agony. But Malik was not a soft corporate criminal like Spencer. He was a violent street thug who had simply put on a designer tuxedo to legitimize his brutality. He realized in that exact moment that his entire life was completely over. His fake real estate empire was gone. His offshore accounts were drained. The angry mob surrounding the stage was ready to tear him apart with their bare hands. Malik completely snapped. With a sudden terrifying surge of pure adrenaline, Malik twisted his body, ignoring the excruciating pain in his ruined leg. He shoved the church elder backward with a violent thrust of his massive shoulders. The elder stumbled and fell, giving Malik the crucial split second he needed. He reached deep inside the breast pocket of his tailored black tuxedo jacket and pulled out a heavy, compact, concealed steel handgun. The moment the dull black metal of the weapon caught the harsh theatrical stage lights, a collective scream of pure absolute horror erupted from the front rows. The angry shouts of the congregation instantly morphed into a deafening chorus of pure terror. People began violently shoving each other backward, desperately trying to scramble away from the altar and hide behind the heavy, solid oak pews. Malik did not hesitate. He lunged forward, dragging his bad leg behind him, and grabbed my arm with a crushing, vicious grip. He yanked me violently backward, pulling my body flush against his chest. His thick, heavy forearm wrapped tightly around my neck, choking off my air as he jammed the cold, hard barrel of the handgun directly into my side, pushing it painfully against my ribs through the heavy silk fabric of my wedding gown. "Get back!" Malik roared, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and the stained glass windows like thunder. He waved the gun erratically toward the front rows before pressing it hard against my side again. "Everyone get back right now, or I swear to God I will kill her right here on this stage." The massive, cavernous church went deathly silent. The kind of absolute terrifying silence that only happens when 2,000 people collectively hold their breath in sheer panic. The only sound in the room was Malik's ragged, heavy breathing and the quiet, terrified sobbing of the congregation hiding behind the pews. The church elders, who had been ready to demand their money back, now stood completely frozen, their hands raised slowly in the air, completely powerless against a desperate, cornered man with a loaded weapon. Malik tightened his grip around my throat, his heart pounding violently against my back. "Nobody moves," he screamed, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. He glared at the deacons blocking the main sanctuary doors. I want those doors open right now. I want a clear path out of this building, and I want a clear path to my car. If anyone tries to stop me, or if anyone calls the cops, I will put a bullet right through her spine. Do you understand me? Open the doors." The deacons at the back of the room looked at each other in absolute terror, completely unsure of what to do. They were just normal men volunteers who managed the church grounds, not hostage negotiators. They slowly began to reach for the heavy brass deadbolts, terrified that any sudden movement would cause Malik to pull the trigger. Down on the plush white carpet of the altar, my mother Vivica had been watching the entire horrifying scene unfold. She was on her hands and knees, her expensive emerald green designer gown torn and stained with sweat and dirt. She looked up at me with the cold steel barrel of the gun pressed painfully into my ribs. But she did not scream for my safety. She did not beg the violent monster holding me hostage to spare her youngest daughter's life. Maternal instinct did not even register in her dark, greedy mind. Vivica dragged herself forward across the carpet, her eyes completely wild and manic, not focusing on the gun, but focusing entirely on the angry, wealthy donors still hiding in the pews. "Eden," she cried out, her voice trembling with a pathetic, desperate greed. "Please, Eden, you have to fix this." She clasped her hands together in a twisted, mocking gesture of prayer. "Just tell them it is a lie, Eden," she begged, her voice echoing through the silent, terrified sanctuary. "Tell the congregation that the bank statements on their phones are fake. Tell them you hacked the network to play a cruel joke. Just say you made it all up because you were jealous of your sister. Please just tell them it is a lie, so your father does not go to federal prison and we do not lose our beautiful house. We can still fix this family if you just tell them you lied." I stood completely still, locked in the crushing grip of the man who had physically abused me for 6 months, with a loaded gun pressed against my organs. And I looked down at my mother. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, the woman who was literally watching a criminal threaten to end my life, and whose only concern in the entire world was maintaining her fraudulent grip on a stolen empire. She would gladly watch me bleed out on the altar if it meant she could keep her country club memberships and her imported luxury cars. I looked at her with an absolute, profound, overwhelming disgust. It was a disgust so deep and absolute that it completely eradicated whatever tiny, lingering shred of daughterly love I might have still subconsciously held onto. She was not a mother. She was a parasite. She was a hollow, greedy shell of a human being, and I was completely, entirely done with her. I did not even dignify her pathetic begging with a verbal response. I simply turned my eyes away from her writhing form on the floor, dismissing her existence entirely. I shifted my gaze slightly, looking out of the corner of my eye at the desperate, sweating man holding me hostage. Malik's hand was shaking so violently that the barrel of the gun kept slipping and scraping against the structured bodice of my gown. His breathing was erratic, a clear sign of a man who was completely losing his grip on reality. I did not flinch. My heart rate remained perfectly steady, my breathing calm and controlled. I had spent months preparing for this exact moment, anticipating every single move they could possibly make. "You cannot even hold the gun right." "Malik," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, terrified silence of the room with absolute clinical precision. My tone was entirely flat, devoid of any fear or panic. Malik flinched slightly, his grip loosening just a fraction of an inch as my calm demeanor completely short-circuited his attempt at intimidation. "Shut your mouth!" he hissed, his voice trembling as he pressed the barrel harder against my ribs. I did not stop. I simply spoke louder, making sure my voice carried across the silent stage. "Your wrist is completely limp," I informed him coldly. "Your finger is resting incorrectly against the trigger guard, and your safety catch is still fully engaged. You are not a dangerous criminal mastermind, Malik. You are just a pathetic, stupid coward wearing a very expensive suit trying to play a tough guy game you do not even understand." Malik's eyes went wide with confusion and rising panic. He instinctively glanced down at the weapon in his shaking hand, trying to check the safety catch I had just mentioned. It was a fatal, microscopic lapse in his concentration. At that exact moment, a sound pierced through the heavy walls of the church. It started as a distant wail and rapidly amplified into a deafening mechanical roar. Heavy, blaring emergency sirens converged on the building from every single direction, cutting through the Sunday afternoon quiet of the city. Red and blue flashing lights began to strobe aggressively through the massive stained glass windows, casting chaotic, spinning shadows across the terrified faces of the congregation. The authorities had arrived, and the absolute destruction of my family was finally here. The heavy wail of multiple police sirens pierced through the thick stained glass windows of the sanctuary, drowning out the angry shouts of the trapped congregation. Malik pressed the cold steel barrel of his handgun harder into my ribs, his chest heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. The entire church, which had just been a boiling cauldron of righteous fury, suddenly froze in absolute terror. 2,000 people dropped to the floor, hiding behind the heavy wooden pews as the reality of a live firearm in the hands of a desperate cornered man took hold. Pure panic set in as the screams echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Over by the choir loft, Spencer realized that his entire life of white-collar privilege was about to end in a violent hostage situation. He scrambled to his feet, completely abandoning his weeping wife, and tried to sprint toward a narrow side door that led to the alleyway. He did not even make it 5 steps. A group of angry, broad-shouldered choir members who had just realized their tithes were stolen tackled the arrogant investment banker directly to the hardwood floor. Spencer went down hard, screaming in panic as they pinned his arms behind his back, effectively neutralizing him. My mother remained on her knees on the plush white carpet of the altar, but she was not looking at the gun pressed against my side. Her eyes were completely wild, darting between the furious congregation and her cowering husband. Vivica crawled forward, but she did not beg the violent criminal to spare her daughter's life. "Please, Eden," she cried out, her voice trembling with pathetic, desperate greed. "Just tell them you made it all up. Tell them the bank statements on their phones are fake. Just say it is a lie, so your father does not go to jail and we do not lose the house. We can still fix this." I looked down at my mother with a profound, overwhelming disgust that seemed to echo in the hollow space where my daughterly love used to be. She was literally watching a monster threaten to end my life, and her only concern was maintaining her fraudulent grip on a stolen empire. She would gladly watch me bleed out on the altar if it meant she could keep her emerald necklaces and her country club memberships. I shifted my gaze back to Malik. His hand was shaking so violently that the barrel of the gun kept slipping against the structured bodice of my ruined Vera Wang gown. I did not flinch. My heart rate remained perfectly steady as I looked at the man who had terrorized me for 6 months. "You cannot even hold a gun right, Malik," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room with absolute clinical precision. "Your finger is not even properly resting on the trigger guard, and your safety is still engaged. You are just a pathetic coward wearing a very expensive suit." "Shut your mouth!" Malik screamed, spit flying from his trembling lips. "I will kill you right here, Eden. I swear to God I will do it." He looked out at the furious deacons blocking the back exits. "I want a clear path to my car right now or she dies on this stage." Before he could take a single step backwards, a massive, deafening crash shook the very foundation of the building. The heavy, solid oak doors at the back of the sanctuary, the same doors the deacons had just locked, were violently blown completely off their thick iron hinges. Splintered wood and shattered brass rained down onto the marble foyer. The feds had arrived. A tidal wave of tactical officers flooded into the center aisle of the church. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, spreading out across the massive room. They wore heavy black Kevlar vests and tactical helmets, but these were not local police officers. The bold yellow block letters across their chests read IRSCI and FBI. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents poured through every single side door and emergency exit, effectively sealing off the entire perimeter of Greater Zion Fellowship within a matter of seconds. "Drop your weapon and put your hands in the air," a voice boomed over a heavy tactical megaphone, the sound bouncing violently off the vaulted ceiling. Dozens of bright red laser sights suddenly cut through the dim lighting of the sanctuary, crisscrossing over the empty pews and converging directly onto the altar. The tiny red dots painted the chests of my father, my mother, and Spencer, who was still pinned to the floor by the choir. But most of the lasers settled directly onto Malik. Malik froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming force that had just breached the building. He tried to pull me tighter against his body, using me as a human shield, but I pushed back against his chest. I simply turned my head slightly to look him directly in his bloodshot eyes. "You really thought you were outsmarting a simple corporate auditor?" I whispered to him, my voice low and completely devoid of any fear. "You thought you could just intimidate me and hit me whenever you felt like it, and I would just cower in the corner and balance your books." Malik stared at me, his tough guy facade rapidly crumbling into absolute terrified confusion. "What are you talking about?" He choked out his grip on the gun, faltering as the red lasers danced across his vision. "I do not work for a private accounting firm." "Malik," I said, stepping slowly forward, deliberately, pushing my body away from the barrel of his weapon. "I never have. I am a senior undercover agent for the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. My badge number is 7429. This entire wedding, this entire relationship, this entire pathetic submissive little act I have been playing for the last 6 months, it was all a federally sanctioned multi-agency sting operation." The color completely drained from Malik's face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. My father let out a loud, suffocating gasp from behind the pulpit, his hands grasping at his chest as the reality of my words destroyed his entire universe. "We have been monitoring every single wire transfer you made." I continued, my voice carrying clearly to the federal agents who were slowly advancing up the center aisle, their weapons drawn and steady. "We tracked every offshore account in the Cayman Islands. We monitored every fake invoice you submitted through my father's corrupt building fund. We let you believe you were a criminal mastermind just so we could trace the absolute top of the financial pyramid. We needed to map out the entire money laundering network before we pulled the trigger." "But the best part," Malik, I said, smiling coldly at the man who had caused me so much physical pain, "the absolute best part was last night. You thought you were teaching me a lesson when you threw me against the wall and gave me this black eye. You thought you were breaking my spirit to keep me quiet about the missing church funds. But you did not break me. You simply gave me the final key to your cage." Malik's jaw dropped open, his eyes darting frantically from my bruised face to the heavily armed tactical units surrounding the stage. "That assault gave my team the exigent circumstances and the probable cause we needed to legally breach your residential property," I explained, savoring the look of total, absolute defeat in his eyes. "While you were busy sleeping off your violent rage in the master bedroom last night, a federal tactical team quietly breached the lower level of your mansion. They cracked your physical safe hidden behind the wine cellar. They completely bypassed your primitive security codes and secured the actual hard physical ledgers you were arrogant enough to keep in your home. We have the original books, Malik. We have the original signatures tying you, Spencer, and my father directly to over $50 million in federal tax fraud and corporate embezzlement." Malik looked down at the gun in his hand as if he had never seen it before. His tough street criminal persona entirely dissolved, leaving nothing behind but a weak, pathetic coward who had finally been caught in a trap he could not punch his way out of. "Look down at your chest, Malik," I commanded softly. He slowly lowered his gaze to his own torso. Right over his rapidly beating heart, a single perfectly still bright red laser dot was resting on his white tuxedo shirt. It was coming from the choir loft, high above the congregation, where a federal sniper had taken a secure overwatch position through the upper windows. "If you twitch your finger, you die," I told him. "If you try to run, you die. It is completely over. You lost." The heavy steel handgun slipped from Malik's trembling fingers and hit the plush white carpet with a dull thud. His knees buckled instantly, and he collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The big, tough real estate mogul, the man who loved to terrorize women behind closed doors, was weeping like a terrified infant, his face buried in his hands as he realized he was going away for the rest of his natural life. "Move, move, move!" an agent shouted from the center aisle. Within seconds, the tactical team swarmed the altar, entirely overwhelming the space. 3 heavily armored agents grabbed Malik by his shoulders, yanking him roughly to his feet. They slammed him face down onto the glass communion table, shattering the delicate surface as they wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs echoed across the stage. At the exact same time, 2 IRS criminal investigators flanked my father. Pastor Calvin desperately tried to back away, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Brothers, please!" he babbled, his deep preaching voice reduced to a frantic, high-pitched whine. "I am a man of God. This is a house of worship. There must be some kind of administrative misunderstanding. We can settle this civilly." "Save it for the federal judge, Calvin," a senior agent said, grabbing my father by his expensive clerical robes and spinning him around. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." Vivica shrieked a high, piercing sound of pure agony as the agents forced her husband to his knees, locking the steel cuffs around his wrists. She crawled toward him, her emerald gown tangling around her legs, tears streaking her heavy makeup. "No," she screamed, clawing at the agent's boots. "You cannot take him. He is the pastor. You cannot take our money. We built this church." An agent gently but firmly pulled Vivica away from her arrested husband, guiding her to sit on the remaining intact pew at the front of the stage. She sat there rocking back and forth, completely broken, muttering about her stolen jewelry and her ruined reputation. She did not look at me once. She only mourned the loss of her wealth and her elite social standing. Over by the choir section, Spencer was actively hyperventilating. The choir members who had tackled him backed away with their hands raised, letting the federal agents take over. Spencer did not even try to fight. He just laid on the floor, crying hysterically, begging for his father, claiming he had nothing to do with the church finances and that Malik had forced him to sign the fraudulent bank documents. The agents hauled him up by his belt, dragging the weeping investment banker across the floor and slapping the cuffs onto his wrists. Whitney stood a few feet away, watching her supposedly wealthy, powerful husband cry like a small child. The look of absolute disgust on her face was almost poetic. Her perfect golden life, the mansion, the cars, the country club memberships had just evaporated right in front of her eyes. She had spent her entire life looking down on me, and now she was married to a convicted felon with absolutely zero assets to his name. I stood in the center of the chaotic altar, smoothing down the front of my ruined wedding gown. The congregation was slowly being escorted out of the building by local police units, their faces a mixture of shock, outrage, and deep vindication. The people finally knew the truth. They knew their sacrifices had funded the criminal greed of my family, and they knew the federal government was going to seize those stolen assets and return them to the community. A tall man in a dark windbreaker stepped through the swarm of tactical officers and walked directly toward me. It was Agent Harris, my handling officer for the undercover operation. He looked around at the destroyed altar, the shattered glass pulpit, and the 3 men being marched away in heavy steel chains. He stopped in front of me and offered a rare, genuine smile. "You took a massive risk overriding the audio-visual system, Eden," he said, his tone entirely respectful. "Broadcasting those bank statements to the congregation was not in the operational playbook. You almost started a full-scale riot in here." I looked at him and let out a long, slow breath, feeling the adrenaline finally start to fade from my system. The congregation deserved to know the truth. "Agent Harris," I replied, wiping a smudge of dirt from my cheek. "They deserve to see the evidence with their own eyes before the defense attorneys tried to spin this into a simple accounting error. I needed to burn the illusion completely to the ground." Harris nodded slowly, looking at the dark purple bruise blooming around my left eye. He pulled a small field radio from his belt. "Medical team to the main stage," he commanded into the receiver. "We need a full physical evaluation on Agent Eden." "I am fine, Harris. I said softly, turning to watch Malik being dragged down the main aisle, his feet stumbling over the white runner that was supposed to lead us to holy matrimony. I have never been better. The heavy steel doors of the sanctuary remained wide open, letting the cool afternoon air sweep through the massive room. The thick scent of deception and stolen wealth was finally being washed away. The feds were systematically bagging computers, seizing physical files from the administrative offices, and locking down the entire megachurch campus. The empire of Greater Zion Fellowship had officially fallen. The Blackwell Trust was completely eradicated. The people who had tortured me, dismissed me, and sold me to a monster were now facing the absolute total destruction of their entire existence. I did not turn back to look at my mother rocking on the pew. I did not look at my sister staring blankly at the wall. I simply walked down the steps of the altar, my head held high, completely untouchable. I walked past the federal agents who nodded respectfully as I passed. I walked out of the heavy wooden doors and into the bright, blinding sunlight of a brand new, completely free life, leaving the ashes of my toxic family far behind me. The heavily armored federal agents did not hesitate for a single second as they began physically dragging the men away in heavy steel chains. The polished marble floors of the church altar were scuffed and scratched by the heavy tactical boots of the SWAT team as they hauled the three criminals toward the shattered wooden doors. Spencer was thrashing wildly against the grip of the two large agents holding his arms, his expensive tailored suit bunching up around his shoulders as his polished loafers dragged across the white carpet. "This is an illegal search and seizure," Spencer screamed, his voice cracking in a pathetic display of panic. "You cannot do this to me. I know my civil rights. I demand to speak to my corporate attorney right now. You have no idea who you are dealing with." A senior IRS agent walking directly behind him did not even break his stride. He simply reached out and grabbed the back of Spencer's collar, giving it a sharp, violent jerk that snapped Spencer's head back and instantly silenced his pathetic whining. "You do not have any civil rights when you are being indicted on 74 counts of federal wire fraud and international money laundering," the agent stated, his voice echoing clearly over the chaotic noise of the sanctuary. "Save your breath for the federal judge, you arrogant little thief." The agents shoved Spencer forward, marching him directly out of the building behind Malik and my father, who were both hanging their heads in absolute terrified defeat. The heavy clinking sound of their steel handcuffs faded down the long hallway, leaving Whitney and Vivica completely alone, standing frozen in the absolute ruins of their entirely false empire. The congregation had been fully evacuated by the local police, leaving the massive vaulted sanctuary, feeling cold, empty, and terrifyingly silent, except for the harsh crackle of federal police radios. Whitney was trembling violently, her perfectly manicured hands clutching the sides of her expensive silk dress, as she stared at the empty aisle, where her husband had just been dragged away like a common street thug. Vivica was still kneeling on the floor, her torn emerald gown spread out around her like a puddle of toxic waste. She was staring blankly at the shattered glass of the holy pulpit, completely unable to process the horrifying reality that her absolute social supremacy had just been permanently eradicated in front of the entire city. Before either of them could even attempt to speak to me, a female federal agent stepped firmly onto the stage. She moved with a cold, clinical efficiency, her tactical vest heavy with magazines and a gold badge shining brightly on her belt. She walked directly up to Whitney and held out her hand. "Take the necklace and the ring off right now," the agent commanded, her voice leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. Whitney gasped, her hands immediately flying up to protect her throat where a massive custom diamond collar rested against her collarbone. She took a stumbling step backward, shaking her head in pure disbelief. "No!" she whimpered, her voice entirely devoid of its usual arrogant cruelty. "No, you cannot take these. They were a gift from my husband. They are my personal property." The agent did not blink. She stepped directly into Whitney's personal space, completely invading her comfort zone. Your husband purchased those diamonds using stolen federal funds funneled through a fake charitable trust, the agent stated coldly. They are not a gift. They are physical evidence of a massive financial crime, and they belong to the United States government. Take them off right now, or I will physically remove them from your body myself and add a resisting arrest charge to your files. Whitney let out a choked, humiliating sob. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely work the delicate clasp at the back of her neck. The heavy diamond necklace fell into the agent's waiting palm with a dull clink. Whitney then slowly pulled the massive engagement ring off her finger, the very ring she had spent years shoving in my face to prove how much better her life was than mine. She dropped the ring into the agent's hand, completely stripped of her golden child armor. The female agent turned her attention down to the floor where Vivica was still kneeling. The agent reached down and effortlessly snatched the massive imported crocodile skin designer purse right out of Vivica's limp hands. This is being confiscated as material evidence of money laundering, the agent announced, simply turning on her heel and marching off the stage without another glance at the two devastated women. Penniless, completely exposed, and thoroughly humiliated in front of the entire federal task force. Whitney slowly turned to look down at her mother. The absolute panic and terror in Whitney's eyes instantly morphed into a dark, vicious hatred. All the years of toxic conditioning, all the superficial love that was entirely based on wealth and status completely inverted itself in a matter of seconds. "This is your fault!" Whitney screamed, her voice tearing through the empty church. She lunged toward Vivica, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. "You did this to me! You ruined my entire life!" Vivica scrambled backward on the carpet, her eyes wide with shock as her golden child advanced on her like a rabid animal. "Whitney, what are you talking about?" Vivica cried out, trying to shield her face with her arms. "You taught me to be exactly like this!" Whitney shrieked, tears of absolute fury streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "You taught me to marry for money. You taught me to ignore where the cash came from as long as the checks cleared. You turned me into a pathetic, useless parasite just like you. And now, I have absolutely nothing. I am going to prison because I listened to you." Whitney threw herself onto the floor, tackling her own mother directly onto the shattered glass of the communion table. The two women fiercely attacked each other, tearing at each other's hair and ripping their expensive designer gowns in a brutal, pathetic display of misplaced rage. Vivica screamed and clawed at Whitney's face while Whitney blindly punched her mother in the shoulders, shrieking about her ruined reputation and her frozen bank accounts. I stood mere inches away from the violent, desperate struggle, and I simply watched them destroy themselves. I did not lift a single finger to stop it. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sadness for the two women rolling on the floor like wild animals. They were finally experiencing the exact same brutal, unhinged violence they had gladly allowed Malik to inflict on me. I watched them tear each other apart for a few moments, savoring the absolute poetry of their mutual destruction, before I finally turned my back on them forever and walked away. I walked down the center aisle of the church, the heavy double doors completely blown open, revealing the bright, beautiful world outside. The crisp Atlanta air felt incredibly sharp and clean, hitting my face as I stepped out onto the wide concrete stairs. The afternoon sun was shining brightly, completely illuminating the massive fleet of dark federal vehicles blocking the entire avenue. I made my way toward a massive armored federal SUV parked at a harsh angle across the intersection. My commanding officer, Agent Harris, was waiting for me leaning against the warm black hood with a thick stack of manila evidence transfer forms resting on the metal. He did not say a word about the violent chaos inside the church. He simply slid a black ink pen across the hood of the truck and tapped the bottom line of the heavy paperwork. There was no long emotional monologue. There was no tearful reflection on the family I had just legally decimated. There was no forgiveness in my heart, and I did not waste a single second trying to find any. There was only pure, unadulterated victory coursing through my veins as I picked up the pen. My signature flowed smoothly across the page, officially turning the entire Blackwell family empire over to the federal government. I signed page after page, transferring the complete ruin of their lives into the hands of the authorities. When the final signature was complete, I set the pen down. I reached up and grabbed the heavy beaded edge of my expensive wedding veil. The delicate white tulle that had been suffocating me all day felt like a physical manifestation of the submissive victim persona I had been forced to wear. I yanked it roughly, pulling the sharp metal hairpins directly out of my scalp. My hair tumbled down around my shoulders as I tossed the veil carelessly onto the dirty asphalt, completely shedding the fake identity they thought they had trapped me in. I turned away from the federal convoy and began walking down the blocked-off street, leaving the circus of police barricades entirely behind me. On the corner of the sidewalk, sitting next to a rusted street lamp, was a dark green metal donation bin for a local charity. I stopped and looked down at my left hand. Resting on my ring finger was the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring Malik had forced onto my hand. It was a $50,000 rock that was supposed to symbolize his absolute ownership over me. I slid the cold metal over my knuckle, holding the diamond up to the bright sun for one brief second. Without any hesitation at all, I tossed the heavy ring directly into the open slot of the donation bin. The expensive diamond hit the hollow metal bottom with a loud, satisfying clatter, completely discarding Malik's power into the literal trash. I reached into the hidden pocket I had carefully sewn into the layers of my wedding dress and pulled out my real set of keys. I pressed the small silver button on the fob. Half a block down the street, sitting quietly in a reserved parking space, a sleek midnight black Porsche Panamera chirped to life. The aggressive low rumble of the twin-turbo engine echoed beautifully off the brick buildings. I had not bought that beautiful machine with stolen tithes or fraudulent offshore accounts. I bought it entirely with my own hard-earned legitimate federal salary. It was the absolute physical proof of the incredibly successful independent life I had built entirely in the shadows, while my family was busy treating me like a pathetic failure. I walked over to the car and pulled the heavy door open, sliding into the pristine black leather interior. The air conditioning kicked on instantly, cooling the sweat on my neck. I pushed the heavy silk skirt of the wedding gown out of the way and pressed my foot down onto the brake, hitting the ignition button. The digital dashboard lit up instantly, connecting to my phone. I did not hesitate to turn the volume dial all the way up. A heavy, loud hip-hop track blasted through the premium surround sound system, completely drowning out the distant wail of the police sirens behind me. I shifted the massive car into drive and pressed my foot hard against the accelerator. The powerful engine roared as the black Porsche shot forward, tearing down the empty avenue. I glanced up at the rearview mirror for one brief final second. I saw the spinning red and blue police lights reflecting off the glass buildings. I saw the absolute ruins of the false empire my toxic family had built on lies and greed, shrinking into a tiny, insignificant blur. I left my completely broken bloodline in the rearview mirror, and I did not look back again, driving straight toward a brilliant, successful future that was entirely and unapologetically my own. The greatest lesson from this story is that blood does not always guarantee loyalty, and true wealth is never built on deception. Sometimes the very people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need to defend yourself against. True power does not come from fake empires or stolen money, but from your own independence and the quiet strength it takes to walk away from a toxic environment. You never have to accept abuse just because it comes wrapped in the word family. Drop the weight of their expectations and build a life entirely your own. Tell me about a time you had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace in the comments below, and remember to subscribe for more stories of survival and independence.